Hey guys, and welcome back to Just Ask Jason, our weekly devotional here at Berean. As usual, if this is at all useful to you, if this is a helpful video for you, we would love for you to subscribe, for you to like our pages and our post here and share it with your friends and family. It's actually really helpful to us. It helps get the word out about our church, it helps get the word out about the various ministries that we offer, and it helps get some of our teachings disseminated out there in the public where they can be helpful to some people. So if you have the time, please like, please share, please subscribe, please do all that stuff because it really does help us a lot, and hopefully it's helpful to others around you as well. Now, here's the Devo. The book of Revelation. It's scary, it's weird, it's out there, and honestly, most of us kind of avoid it because we don't know what to do with it. We've been told over and over again it's about the end of the world. We've been told, if we've been in church for a long time, about dispensations and about the apocalypse and about people being left behind and all sorts of really strange things that we don't really know what to make of. The reality is, though, that Revelation is much more about the here and now than it is about the end of the world. The Revelation is actually very hopeful, and it can be very simple if we just apply a few basic rules as to how to interpret it, and we have a good knowledge of the Old Testament, especially of Old Testament prophecy. If we understand how those things work, we can interpret Revelation really easily. Now, I will give you a warning up front. Because Revelation is very symbolic, you'll hear me say a lot, this is a symbol for this, and this is a symbol for this. And basically, I'll end up looking like this guy. I am not, however, a conspiracy theorist. I'm not at all. And honestly, when it comes to like a scale of like weird interpretations of Revelation and like very vanilla, boring interpretations of Revelation, I lean more towards the boring side. You're not going to hear about dispensations. You're not going to hear about left behind. You're not going to hear about much of that stuff, well, at all, because honestly, I just don't think it's there. So we're going to take the fourth chapter of Revelation, and after we do a little bit of background work, we're going to look at that, we're going to interpret it, and I hope that by the end of this video you realize Revelation isn't near as scary as some of us have been taught to believe. So what is the book of Revelation? Well, it identifies itself, it gives itself a title in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place. And he sent it and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. So right up there, up front, we have who wrote it, kind of sort of Jesus, but he wrote it through John. He told John what to write down. And we have the title of the book. It calls itself the Revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, the word revelation is interesting because the word behind it, the Greek word that we're translating there, is apocalypsis, which is actually the word we get apocalypse from. So in some literature, you'll actually hear Revelation called the Apocalypse of John. I think actually the most accurate term for this would be the Apocalypse of Jesus Christ, because that's what Jesus calls it. That's what the beginning of the book of Revelation calls itself, is the Apocalypse of Jesus Christ. Now, what is an apocalypse? In English, normally when we say the apocalypse, we mean, oh no, it's the end of the world. But that's not what the word would have meant in the first century when this book was written. An apocalypse was a type of literature. Kind of like how we have like fiction and nonfiction, and then we have smaller like subcategories. So we have like poetry on the one hand, and we have like autobiographies, and we have biographies that are written by other people. We have history textbooks, we have science textbooks, we have all these different genres of book. Apocalypse is actually a genre, like an autobiography is a genre of book. And what an apocalypse is a type of writing that is usually displayed as a journey through heaven that's guided by God, or if it's a pagan that wrote it, and then by one of multiple gods, or by an angel or some other sort of heavenly representative. It's usually heavily symbolic, especially Hebrew apocalypse, and that's what this is. This is a Hebrew apocalyptic literature. And amongst those symbols, you'll see a lot of numbers. And now we get caught up on some of these. Like, even if you aren't a Christian, you've probably heard of the really famous number 666, right? That is an example of something called gematria. And gematria is really weird, it's really foreign, and no one really does it anymore. Basically, they take a word And then using a series of really standard rules, they would relate each number into or each letter of the word into a number, and then they would multiply or they would add the numbers, and they would come up with sort of a code, like a spy movie type thing, where they like encode words, but instead of being another word or a foreign language or something, they turn it into numbers. And that's really, really weird for us. Like, we don't really know what to do with that, but it was pretty common practice in the ancient world. You also see other numbers that are just numbers, but they represent something important. Like 7 normally represents completion or perfection. 12 normally symbolizes the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. 3 is normally seen as a number associated with God because you have the Trinity. You have the 3 holes, 2 in Jesus's wrist and then 1 through his feet. So you have these different symbols that are typically associated with certain concepts. And all of this sounds, like we said before, a little bit like a conspiracy theory. But once you get the rules kind of worked out in your head, you'll realize that the message of Revelation is actually pretty normal stuff. It's stuff that you hear in every other book of the Bible. It's not really crazy or out there. It's just written in a kind of weird way. Most of these symbols in Revelation will be very culturally tied. They're going to be very Hebrew or very Old Testament, or in some cases they're going to be very Greco-Roman because of the group that John was writing to. So for us as 21st century Americans, for the most part, then we're going to have to research some of these symbols a little bit. We're going to have to kind of research the culture. We're going to have to understand what they're going through. We're going to have to understand what these symbols would have meant to the original audience. And that's always a key when you're interpreting the Bible. What would this have meant to the original audience? If you can answer that question 95% of the time, you're going to know exactly what the Bible wants you to know. Now it's time for our dry run. We're going to do all of Revelation chapter 4. That's verses 1 through 11. Now, because it's a longer chunk of text, pause right here and read it if you need to. I'm not going to read it for you because, like I said, it's a pretty long chunk of text and we're trying to keep the video as short as possible. So go ahead and pause now and read that and then come back when you're done. So as we work through Revelation chapter 4, we see obviously a lot of really weird images. Let's just kind of catalog them to start off. There's a door in heaven, a voice like a trumpet, a man made out of precious stones, a throne, 24 other thrones, and people called elders. There's white garments, there's crowns, there's lightning and thunder, there's 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God, and that doesn't make any sense to us. There's a sea of glass. There's 4 freaky looking things called living creatures that have 4 faces and are covered with eyeballs. And then last of all, this one's not a symbol, but it is important. All of these living creatures, both the 4 living creatures and the elders, they all fall down and worship this person made of precious stones and says that they are Lord and God. Once you kind of catalog all the actions and symbols going on in a chapter or in a passage of Revelation, the next step is to figure out what each individual symbol means. It kind of becomes like an algebra equation at this point. We have like different variables, like a plus b plus c plus d equals what? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what does variable a equal? What does variable b equal? What does variable c equal? And once we figure out what those variables or what those symbols mean, we can plug them all into the equation, we can add them together, and then at the end we'll know what the passage means. It's actually really simple. It is a lot of hard work though, but I've done the work for you this time. So let's start interpreting those symbols. There's a door in heaven, which is a pretty standard introductory element for any apocalypse or prophetic writing. It's really popular amongst Hebrews. They'd say that the heavens opened or there was a door in heaven, and it'll kind of introduce a prophecy that way. It's just a way of saying this is from God, I was given special information, that kind of thing. And then you hear a voice like a trumpet. And a voice like a trumpet was actually identified in chapter 1. So here's a pro tip for Revelation and for prophecies. Sometimes in the Bible, when you read one of these weird symbolic passages, the person who's writing it will actually explain some of the symbols to you. So in this case, in chapter 1, the person whose voice was like a trumpet was identified as Jesus, as the resurrected Messiah. So the voice like a trumpet is Jesus, is God speaking. Remember, Jesus and God are the same. They are three in one and one in three. So they are the same. There's a man appearing to be made out of jasper carnelian and surrounded like by a rainbow that looks like emerald. In this image, these images of precious stones or things that appear like precious stones usually implies splendor, high value, or beauty. All right, so we have this idea of there's this very valuable, the Greek word means glory, very glorious person that is sitting on this throne. A throne symbolizes power, and so we have this person who is very glorious, that is very valuable, that is very important, that is sitting on a throne, so they have a lot of power. There's 24 other thrones, and there's elders on them. Now, this symbol is actually pretty contentious because it's not one that's used elsewhere. The thrones still mean power, and in light of the rest of the passage, it probably means they have lesser power than the one sitting on the central throne. But what do you do with the elders? Elders normally are not a symbol used in Scripture very often. So people kind of argue about, are these angelic beings? Are these representations of people or people groups? Are they possibly representative of the 12 patriarchs and the 12 apostles? There's about 13 different mainstream interpretations plus dozens of like lesser known ones that are all thrown together. That number 13 comes from Alan F. Johnson, who's a professor at Wheaton College. He says there's about 13 mainstream interpretations of this passage. And for the most part, even the most respected scholars can't agree on what this means. So there is still a little bit of mystery in Revelation. If you want my 2 cents on it, 24 is 12 times 2. Remember, Revelation likes to play with numbers. And 12 is normally a symbol of the tribes of Israel. So if you have 12 2 times, it seems to imply that there's the 12 tribes of Israel and then some people beyond it. So I think this is a representation or symbol for the Old Testament followers of God and the New Testament church who are now in heaven, all united in this picture, worshiping God as one big family, as one big church. I think that's what it means, but that's just one of the 13 interpretations you might hear out there. There's white garments, which usually symbolize purity. That one's pretty standard. It's often associated with God's people. Normally when someone's wearing a white garment, it's one of God's people, although sometimes it's an angel. In addition to this, there are crowns, which normally symbolize power, sometimes glory or value, something like that. So again, we're getting that power motif, we're getting that glory motif. There's lightning and thunder, which again symbolize power, control over the weather. It's normally associated with God himself. The idea is that the only person who can control the weather, that can control the earth, that can change things, that are that grand, well, it has to be God. So almost always lightning and thunder are symbols associated with God himself. There are 7 torches of fire, which are 7 spirits of the church, and that one's really weird for us, but it's identified for us again in chapter 1. Back in chapter 1, then John kind of addresses the letter and says, hey, this is who I'm writing to. I'm writing to these 7 churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And he's saying, hey, I'm writing to these guys, and you are these 7 lampstands that stand before God. So he actually identifies a symbol and says these torches, these lampstands, these candles, they are symbols of the 7 churches that I'm writing to. So we know that these 7 torches of fire are actually symbols of the churches being written to. There's a sea of glass, which can really mean 2 potential things. It probably implies both here. One, whenever the sea shows up in this sort of literature and it's applied in a situation where God is present, it normally implies, well, God has control over the sea, because many ancient religions, you'd have a sea god, a sky god, a mountain god, and the idea is in Christianity and in Judaism, which are called Yahwistic monotheisms, that Yahweh, the supreme God, the God that you and I worship, is not a sea god or a sky god or a mountain god, but he's God of everything. So he controls all those things. So of course, he has thunder and lightning around him because he controls the sky and the weather, but he also has a sea before him because he controls the sea. And he could also have mountains before him because he controls the earth. He could also have people before him because his people belong to him. And even though he gives them free will, he has the capability to control them, to influence their lives if he so desired. So this sea of glass is a reminder that, well, God controls the oceans and the waters, but it's also a reminder of something in the temple. The term here for sea is thalassa, which, well, it just means ocean. It means an open body of water. But the same term is used in Greek translations of the Old Testament to describe a big bronze pot that was placed in the courtyard of the temple and was used in the process of making sacrifices to God. It was called the Bronze Sea or the Brazen Sea or the Molten Sea, depending on exactly how you choose to translate the words there. So this sea, this thalassa that we see here, this sea of glass, might be a reminder of the sea in the temple, especially since the church is represented by torches, and the arrangement of lights in the temple is actually a very important concept. In fact, there's a lot of interpreters that you'll see actually kind of draw out what this image that John is describing would look like, and it actually lays out very similarly to how the tabernacle way back in Exodus would have looked. So this is a reminder that God is existing in, we might say, a heavenly temple, in a perfect realm, that his presence is dwelling in exactly the place that it should be, surrounded by all of his glory, being perpetually worshipped by his people. And that's kind of important, because Hebrews promises the exact same thing, that when Jesus leaves earth, he goes to heaven, which is a more perfect temple, and that one day that temple will come to earth. The temple is symbolic of God's presence in the Old Testament. So the idea is when the perfect temple comes to earth, God will dwell with his people permanently. And that's a really important promise in Christianity. Not that we go to heaven, but that heaven will one day come to us, and there'll be no more sin, no more disease, no more pain. And if you're a Jew and you understand this, and you're reading John's writings, you would have understood that John is painting a picture of a heavenly temple and reminding you of that promise that one day God's going to come to earth. Last of all, we have 4 really freaky looking living creatures with 4 faces and tons of eyes. The faces are a little bit contentious, but a lot of people think they represent different characteristics of God or characteristics of God's action. These creatures are either purely symbols, and they aren't actually real creatures at all, or if they exist, then they must be some sort of angelic or heavenly creature that God's created to serve him. We don't really know which one. As for what characteristics the faces might represent, a pretty good guess is that they represent strength, power, spirituality, or holiness, and swift action, that God is always swift to act, always acts at the right time. But again, that's kind of contentious, and not everyone agrees on that. The eyes covering the creature is less contentious. That's a pretty common picture in Old Testament literature like Isaiah and Ezekiel, which these creatures are probably references to. They are reminders of Old Testament text in Isaiah and Ezekiel. And normally when eyes show up all around a creature, it implies God's omnipotence. It means that, God is everywhere, that God is omniscient, that he is all-knowing, that he's all over the place all the time. He is omnipresent is the word for that. So basically the idea is, just like these creatures can see in all directions, God sees everything that's happening on the earth, right? So now that we've gone through all of those images, what does this passage mean? Let's just summarize it really quick. God is depicted as all kinds of powerful and glorious and perfect. People and angels surround him. And at the end of the passage, everyone falls down and worships God. Now that we've finally gotten through all of those images, what does this passage mean? Well, God is depicted as all kinds of powerful and glorious and perfect. People and angels and all sorts of living creatures are pictured as worshiping him. And in the context of Revelation, the historical context, the people that it was written to, these people were losing their jobs, their friends, their family, occasionally even losing their lives because of Christianity. They're probably thinking, a lot of them, about giving up, deciding, well, this Jesus thing doesn't work and my life would be easier if I abandoned it. So the point of this passage to that original audience seems to be that God is worthy of worship, that he is fully in control, that he is powerful, that he is glorious, that he has created all things, that he has made a promise that one day his heavenly temple will be on earth and he will live with his people face to face, and that even before God acts, even if God doesn't save your job, doesn't save your relationship with your family members, or even doesn't save your life, that he is still worthy of worship because he's still a good God, he's still a powerful God, and ultimately his plan will prevail. And that point we'll actually see repeated a lot. If you interpret a lot of Revelation, a lot of it sounds very similar. The point of many of these passages ends up coming out almost the exact same. It's just, don't give up yet. God's going to win. Don't give up yet. God is in control. That's the point of the entire book of Revelation. You can sum up this entire freaky long book in 2 words. God wins. And that's why I think it's so hopeful. And honestly, even though it's weird and hard to interpret sometimes, for the most part, the message of Revelation is really simple. God wins. So you shouldn't give up yet. If you want to dig into the book of Revelation just a little bit more, there's a handful of resources I can recommend to you. The first one, and my personal favorite, is a collection of essays actually, called Dragons, John, and Every Grain of Sand. It doesn't have an author since there's numerous authors, and I can't remember the editor off the top of my head, but it's an amazing book, a collection of essays about different passages in the book of Revelation. I will caution you with this one that if you aren't comfortable trying to force your way through biblical Greek, skip the first section. The book's divided into 3 different sections. Skip the first one if you're not comfortable with biblical Greek, and then the last 2 sections will be very helpful to literally anyone that wants to learn about the book of Revelation. Another book is Grasping God's Word, which I've recommended before, by Duvall and Hayes. That doesn't just deal with Revelation and apocalyptic literature. It actually is a book about how to interpret every genre in the Bible. And it's super simple. It's super informative. It's about yay big hardcover book. It's a terrific book to have on your bookshelf if you are a Christian and you want to learn more about interpreting Scripture. If you want a free resource, there's the Bible Project on YouTube. Again, a resource that I've recommended before and will continue to recommend, by an amazing preacher by the name of Tim Mackey and some associates of his. That's a terrific resource. You can look it up, and they have videos on all sorts of different things. But one of the very useful ones for interpreting Revelation is a short video series on the book of Revelation, on what it means, on the symbols. And I think they have a video also on how apocalyptic literature looks. So that's definitely worth looking up. Last of all is the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary on Revelation by, I'm going to butcher his name, Buist M. Fanning, edited by Clinton E. Arnold. Now, I don't have this particular commentary, but I love this series, and the Revelation commentary just came out recently. So if you really want to dive deep into the book of Revelation and really get into the nitty-gritty details, that's going to be an amazing book for you. It's on my wish list, and as soon as my wife lets me, I'm going to buy it. So definitely a worthwhile resource to check out. All 4 of those are actually. I hope that now, after the end of this much longer than usual video, that you feel a little bit less nervous about the book of Revelation, a little bit more comfortable, and that maybe you feel like that's a book that you can take on yourself. As always, I'm rooting for you. I'm hoping to see you on Sundays. And if you have my number or the church number and you have a question about the book of Revelation, feel free to call. I can't guarantee that I'll know the answer, but hopefully I can at least point you in the right direction to someone who might know the answer. I appreciate you. I appreciate you spending time with me today. And hopefully you have an amazing week and go out there and just advance the kingdom in some way. We love you and we're rooting for you. Bye.